To check back in with a longtime guest here of the program, Madeline Summerville, who's a political analyst and also an attorney. Thanks so much for joining us, Madeline.
So happy to be here. Thank you, Amy. And I'm sorry for everything y'all are going through right now. I'm happy to be with you.
Well, it's interesting. You've been a guest on our show for a year plus now. We've talked about a lot of different policies and how things play out in the courts. And you're watching this from Georgia, from the state of Georgia. And so I really wanted to kind of get your input too, as somebody who's separated enough from it, but also knows the law. So when we talk about this lawsuit in particular, we know the DOJ has responded. We've got this timeline. I guess the big question that comes to mind, and I don't know if there's an answer or not, Madeline, but is it possible that this could all just be brought to its knees in the court?
So the general answer to that is no. Here's why. The only time that a court can challenge what the federal government is doing in this manner is if they make specific constitutional challenges to specific acts, right? The general decision to have ICE enforcement going on is a political one. And the judges can't make a decision on a political issue. But the federal courts within a state do have the right to be able to challenge something unconstitutional that a government agency does. So breaking that down. So there are specific violations that they're alleging. And you led into one before when you were talking about excessive use of force. So there are two separate main lawsuits that are going on. The first one is by the state of Minnesota and then the city of Minneapolis and the city of St. Paul. And those primarily deal with the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment basically says that the state has a right to allocate its resources in the way that it wants to. And the state has sovereignty, which means it can protect its citizens in the way that it believes is the most efficient and safe way possible, right? And if the federal government comes in and does what's called commandeering, which means basically taking the resources of the state and reallocating it towards whatever project the federal government wants to direct them towards for this agency, that they can't do that. So that's the basis of that one. And then the other lawsuit is from the ACLU, and that's a class action on behalf of people who've had their rights violated for like warrantless arrests and excessive use of force, inability to protest peacefully, things like that.
Okay,
but so that's breaking it down.
Thank you for helping us understand, because there's a lot going on even in the courts too, in addition to what's happening in the streets. So of these two, basically you're saying that you don't anticipate this is something that could be decided and stopped in the courts or allowed in the courts anytime soon, even though we hear, you kind of hear, well, it was fast-tracked by the judge. The arguments were fast-tracked. So it seems like there is obviously a sense of urgency here too, but it just if your hopes are in, will the courts resolve this in any time soon, it doesn't sound like that's where this is going to happen.
So in terms of a general resolution, no, but the fact that Attorney General Keith Ellison said that he wanted a greater measure than a temporary restraining order called a preliminary injunction on ICE's specific behaviors is actually very encouraging. So here's the difference there. What Keith Ellison is saying basically is, I would like the court to make a decision on the merits of what's going on here and not just putting a short stop to things while we think about it, right? I want a not permanent, but a long-lasting stop on these things. And in order for the court to make a decision like that, they have to review what's going on and actually look at things rather than just putting a stamp on something. And so that really means that he believes in the case that the state and the cities have to be able to not end everything, but limit it, to limit the behaviors of ICE, to limit the resources, to not force Minneapolis or St. Paul police to do anything or to allocate resources toward anything that they don't agree with.
Okay, and that's a great point. So initially, the Attorney General had requested a preliminary injunction, and that was denied, right? Because the judge said the DOJ, the federal government, gets a little bit more time to figure things out here on their end.
Right.
And so then you're saying temporary restraining order, citing escalating harm. So I get that piece of it based on merits, which then takes another closer look at kind of the what is happening. But is the what is happening subjective in any way? Is it political in any way? And if the courts don't decide on things that are political, how do you kind of see that playing out?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So the temporary restraining order is one that happens in, like, for example, domestic violence cases. It keeps people away from each other for a very short period of time without the court having to review any specific documentation or evidence. Like, they review a little bit, but not a large amount.
Okay.
Keith Ellison has already asked for a preliminary injunction, but he's doing it again now. In a manner that would allow the court to rule on what evidence they have already. And it won't be a subjective determination. And the reason why is because the only determinations that can be made are on constitutional issues. So they'll review the evidence that the Attorney General brings forth about commandeering, right? Like the federal government and agencies going too far and exceeding their authority, and in allocating resources improperly, things like that. And then also, I don't know if the ACLU will do the same. It's quite possible too, because if they would have to argue that ICE has made a practice in terms of, like, it's their policy to engage in behaviors that violate people's Fourth Amendment rights and Fifth Amendment rights in the state of Minnesota and in the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So it's not a subjective determination, because the only thing that you can decide on is whether or not these individual rights have been violated, or whether there's a general constitutional right that the state of Minnesota or the cities of Minneapolis or St. Paul have had violated.
Okay. Thank you for helping me clear that up. I actually phrased the question incorrectly. It was first a temporary restraining order and then the preliminary injunction. So thank you for flipping those around. I don't want to confuse people any more than I think people are already confused about the legal side.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it is. So again, just total layman here, not knowing anything about the courts. Let's say that a judge is able to make some sort of a ruling. Let's say, let's hope not, but let's say this continues on for weeks and weeks, and we do have some sort of a ruling here. What would happen at that point if a judge said, yeah, okay, let's just say there excessive force is happening. The ruling is no more excessive force. Is there accountability for that? What happens at that point?
That is a great question. So accountability is a really difficult thing in any case, whether it's civil or criminal or administrative, which in this case is administrative, because the assumption in administrative cases like this is that the intentions of the agency are good, right? The assumption is that it's not an intentional violation, but it needs to stop anyways, right? They're always given the deference of, unless there's a clear statement otherwise, unless it's very clear, like black and white, and barely a subjective determination, right? Like as if Kristi Noem wrote down, like, please violate their Fourth Amendment rights. Absent that, it's very difficult to make that general determination. So when they're given that amount of deference, it's very hard to be able to make that general case. So what they have to do is they'll have to say, okay, we're not going to punish you in any way, right? But it seems to us that you have made a practice out of violating people's Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights, or that you have, in the case of the Keith Ellison's case, exceeded the authority of your agency, and therefore you need to stop engaging in X, Y, and Z. So my guess is, while it's possible that everything could stop, it's extremely unlikely. And what's more likely to happen is that the capacity of ICE will be limited. It will narrow the behaviors that they're allowed to engage in. And then the thing that's going to be even harder after that is enforcing that court order. Because when we've just seen Stephen Miller come out and say, Minneapolis and police need to surrender to ICE, as if states have no sovereignty. It's frustrating, because how are you going to police that and enforce that if the administration isn't trusting it? And so you have to keep trying to get accountability through the courts. That kind of accountability for following the court orders just forces people straight back into the courtroom.
Aside from kind of these two big lawsuits that we're talking about that sound like would be extremely unlikely to sort of move us in either direction, aside from all of that, I'm just really curious, as you have been watching all of this kind of play out from afar, but yet also this is your world as a political analyst and an attorney. What have some of your thoughts been? And I ask you this because, you and I have always had these conversations about trying to have really neutral conversations when it comes to things, and that was way before all of this happened. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so for me personally, I kind of drew a line like 2 or 3 weeks ago, um, because certain cases started cropping up, or I guess certain circumstances started cropping up that I could not make a legitimate argument for the other side. And when that happened, I knew that I couldn't defend something that I didn't believe in.
Can you get a
And
little bit more
so
specific for me?
yeah,
And
yeah. So like with Greenland, I did not see any any version of that argument where the administration had a legitimate reason to do what it was doing. And when it comes to the narratives that have been coming out of the Trump administration about what happened with Miss Renee Good, or about the fact that they're arresting violent criminals in Minnesota, which ICE data, as determined by two totally independent sources, one of which is very right leaning, the Cato Institute, have shown that actually 73.6%, they got the same number from ICE data, that 73.6% have no criminal record of the people that are currently in ICE detention. And actually, less than 5% of all of them total have ever been convicted of a violent crime. So my frustration is, even if in that instance, even if there's some argument that could be made for the administration's policies and procedures here, to me, it loses its integrity, because it it seems, not only does it seem to violate what it means to be an American and respecting Americans' rights, but they're not telling the truth about what's going on. And when that happens, it's very difficult for me, and how hard that I've worked to try to maintain my integrity in doing this. It's very hard for me to make a case for another side when I don't feel like there is one.
And I'm curious if that, because I think we hear that on both sides, where it's baby out with the bathwater here.
Yep.
Is that kind of where you are right now, or are you able to find some semblance of truth wherever that might lie?
So I'm having to separate it out in terms of issues. Like, for example, I still think what President Trump is doing with Japan is great. I think that relationship is awesome, and how they've invested in America, and how he's protecting workers' rights, even though like the Nippon Steel company is coming here, right? Like, and dealing with our race with China to try to obtain business in the Eastern Hemisphere. That's awesome. Good work. So I'm finding myself trying to separate out issues specifically, to where I'm not constantly, I don't feel the need to both sides it if there is not another side that I can legitimately argue for. But I'll still give credit where credit is due, always. I just don't feel compelled to do that when I've thoroughly looked through it, and I can't make the argument.
All right.
You know?
Well, thank you for your insight as a political analyst, as an attorney as well. We appreciate it, and all voices are always welcome here. As you know, this is the place to do it. We have the platform for it. So appreciate.
Yeah, of course. And I would love to tell people, the more you protest peacefully, and the more you show evidence of a peaceful protest, the better things will work out. The more things escalate and turn into violence, the more of an excuse you give your opponent to come at you. You want to be able to stay as clean as possible, so that they have no ammunition against you if that's your opponent, right? So it would behoove both sides to make sure that they're following the rules, even though it feels like they don't want to. You know what I mean?
Madeline Summerville, thank you for your time. We always appreciate our conversations with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Take care. All right.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.